Greetings all, and welcome to the 29th episode of the V.T.P, or the Veteran Trainer's Perspective. This episode is going to be quite a bit different from others in that it is meant to be a celebration of something that has been a part of the Pokémon franchise for as long as it has existed. Rather than looking at the Pokémon of the franchise, let us instead take a look back and reflect on what has helped to make every generation of it special and unique in its own way from game to game. Here, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to be taking a long look at the gimmicks and special features that have helped to define the mainline series as it has evolved and become the global juggernaut that it is today. As you all are likely aware, Generation 9 will soon be upon us, and to mark the occasion, I decided to try something a bit different for the occasion. The VT episode here is actually going to be split into 8 different parts that will be examined piece by piece up to the last few days before the release of Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. As such, consider this episode to be a celebration of what has already come to exist in the series thus far, and what may lie in the future for all of us.
With that said, it's important that I be clear here in defining what exactly I mean by a gimmick. In essence, I consider a gimmick in a generation as something that either fundamentally alters the way that the games are played, or a special feature that is featured in multiple generations that has some level of staying power because of whatever sort of influence they might have on the games as a whole. Moreover, there is a distinction to be made that some gimmicks can perpetuate throughout the entire series, while others might only last a generation at most, and the reasons for why certain features have greater longevity than others, or otherwise were cut short, will be made known here. Materials such as characters, items, and different Pokémon will not always be mentioned, since those always seem to be changing with subsequent generations, but mechanics that are derived from them that are distinct in a generation, or multiple ones, will be considered here. Lastly, these gimmicks must have a way to directly impact the player and how they engage with the games and make their journey in them, so there will also be basic concepts that have a more overarching form to them as part of this assessment.
There is a lot to cover here, so without further ado, let's get started.
Ah yes, Generation 1, the place and time where it all began by default, and boy was it one heck of a time. Here in the Counter region, players are given the task of defeating the 8 gym leaders of the land before taking on the Elite Four and Champion to prove themselves, all while fending off the efforts of the diabolical Team Rocket. The franchise itself might not have been the first example of a monster-catching game, but it was far more popular than any other to come before them or since, and there are many reasons why the franchise more than managed to stick the landing on it all. This is where the Pokémon, the classic battle system, and the journey of the trainer lies for all to take part in, to come into a new world to explore and examine to find every rare creature that populates its land and waters. While it might have been the beginning of everything on its own, there is still something to say on the gimmicks that are a part of this generation, and how they help to shape it just beyond the basic groundwork that led to the franchise exceeding all expectations as seen by many others, including its own creators. As such, we now pay due respect by seeing the major gimmicks it introduced that have helped to shape the franchise into the future. Game Corners. Game corners were once a classic staple within Pokémon games that offered players something different to do aside from just catching and battling with Pokémon. While not necessary in all cases, playing around here with a variety of games, primarily slot wheels in the early years, could allow players to earn coins that could then be used to buy special items and even Pokémon that would otherwise be hard or impossible to find elsewhere in the games. Of course, in most incarnations, you could also just spend real money to get the coins, but the exchange rate was purposely skewed to make it extremely difficult for those playing to get enough coins to buy the most valuable of prizes. Still, in many cases, it is especially the easiest, if not the only way, to get some Pokémon like Porygon, who was notorious in older generations for always being the hardest Pokémon to afford and get, and given its combat capabilities, it usually was only done in order to fill out the Pokédex. While this could be blamed for the declining popularity of these game corners over the years, the real issue for why they stopped being a feature in the games is simple. It was starting to be classified as gambling in the games, and that would have affected the age rating and likely hurt sales. As such, the slots will slowly fade out over time, leaving only games like Voltorb Flip before game corners as a whole were shut down entirely and did not make an appearance after Generation 4, with not even the remakes of Generations 3 and 4 featuring them, as the Marvel City Game Corner was closed down entirely and Veilstone's Game Corner was turned into a clothing store. HMs. While TMs, or technical machines, have been a fundamental part of the franchise since its inception and continue to be so today, the same cannot be said for HMs, or hidden machines. These objects are distinct from TMs in a number of ways, chief among them being the fact that unlike original TMs, which could only be used once before this was changed in later generations, HMs could be used an infinite number of times. This was important because they served as utility moves that were meant not necessarily for battle, but for clearing environmental obstacles and required gym badges and internal sense of progress in order to actually be used in the field. These devices helped to mark game progress for sure, but they also had a few flaws in them. For one thing, most of them weren't all that great as moves, oftentimes being quite weak and not useful for serious combat, minus rare exceptions like Surf and Waterfall. Moreover, once a Pokemon learned them, they couldn't forget the move under normal circumstances. Only a move deleter could remove these moves once they were on a Pokemon. This could make them a headache, as it meant that you would have to carry the Pokemon with these moves just to use them in the field, in turn limiting the party members that one could take on one's journey. While they remained a staple for the series for a great deal of time, they were ultimately abandoned in Generation 7 in favor of Ride Pokemon, and since then, the need for them has either been relegated to remakes, or otherwise replaced with items and other special equipment that helps to keep their utility without requiring players to clog up their team with unneeded party members to use them. Considering that better moves were eventually made teachable to others through other means, this decision was probably for the best as a notable quality of life improvement. Safari Zones. Once a critical part of many regions, the Safari Zone has been a source of engagement and frustration for as long as it has existed, and though it is no longer present, it's still remembered for both good and bad reasons by those that have adventured through any version. In essence, inside of a Safari Zone, players are given 30 Safari Balls, as well as some items to use to affect the chances of them capturing a Pokemon, and are given a set amount of distance they can walk before they have to return to the front desk and give back whatever balls they hadn't used, if they have any left. On the one hand, these locations are important because they usually hold rare and exotic Pokemon that cannot be found otherwise in the wild in a region. However, because the Safari Balls only have the strength of a standard Great Ball, and you are trying to capture Pokemon that are at full health, there is inherent difficulty laced within this hunt, and given that you also have to pay a fee to get into the Safari Zones every time you enter them normally, it can add up quickly and really force players to get down and grind in order to find the rare Pokemon they seek inside. While these facilities lasted for quite a while, they were eventually phased out in Generation 4 and did not make an appearance outside of auras past that, and even then the area was radically changed for those games to make the Hoenn Safari Zone much more like just a normal location with wild Pokemon. The exact reason for the removal is unclear, but it did provide an unnecessary level of challenge in the eyes of many players in its departure from the catching mechanics that otherwise dictate the rest of the series, which can make their eventual removal for gameplay balance and consistency understandable. Bugs and glitches. Now, it may seem a bit silly to consider bugs and glitches as a gimmick for any generation, but I think they qualify at the very least for Generation 1 because of just how prevalent they actually were, and how they have come to define the first generation so well in the franchise. While the original Red and Green games were worked on for 6 years before they were actually ready for sale, the game still had a ton of different bugs and glitches that can make the game almost unplayable if steps were not taken to keep the journey as streamlined and normal as possible. Even with further tweaking and the release of Pokemon Blue in Japan, and in turn eventually Pokemon Red and Blue globally, a lot of glitches were still present in the game's code because of both software and hardware limitations and errors. Perhaps the most prominent of all of them is the Old Man glitch that features Missingno and other such glitchy entities that can make life more than a bit interesting in the games to aid in item duplication among other awkward changes. These bugs were so prevalent that they would come to define the early days of the franchise and open the door to many unique ways to manipulate the programming of the games to fit the needs of players, including being the only way that most players could ever get access to the mythical Pokemon Mew. Of course, eventual changes to the way the games were programmed and developed would help to minimize future bugs and glitches, even if they can never truly be completely removed from gameplay of any sort. Friendship. It is often assumed that the concept of friendship didn't arise until Generation 2, but in truth it started in its simplest form in Pokemon Yellow with the player's partner Pikachu. On paper, the concept is pretty easy to understand and work with, as it shows that the actions that players take in training and caring for their Pokemon have a direct impact on their Pokemon, both potentially positive and negative. The more that a Pokemon is battled with and cared for, the more friendly they will become, and while in Yellow this was tied to the acquisition of Bulbasaur in the games and little more, its effects were notably expanded upon in Generation 2 to factor into a great deal of other attributes. It can affect the power of the return and frustration moves for one thing, the moves being introduced in Generation 2 being more powerful the more one's Pokemon like or dislike them respectively. Some Pokemon only evolve through friendship, and thus make it a critical part of filling out one's Pokédex and getting access to a number of Pokemon that have been introduced over time. It can further be used to earn special ribbons and awards that are otherwise inaccessible to them otherwise, and it can even affect the actions taken by one's Pokemon in much later generations, specifically Generation 8, when it was merged with Affection to create an easier to manage system between the two. While it might not have had much of a useful impact in the original Generation 1 games, it has since become a critical part of the franchise and showing visibly and even functionally the bond that players form with their Pokémon over time, and it would be hard to imagine the franchise as it is today without this attribute in play. Make it your own adventure. One of the biggest and yet unspoken gimmicks that defines the franchise as a whole is also one that many might not otherwise see as a gimmick at all. The fact that you can build your own personal Pokémon team to go on a journey with within the games. This seems like a trope of sorts these days, as it is a large part of the monster catching genre, and while Pokémon certainly wasn't the first game to make this a reality, it is the one that certainly popularized it by giving players the chance to truly make an adventure their own in any way they desire. Do you like basic normal types and want to see how far you can get with them? Sure! Do you prefer having a lot of rare and exotic Pokémon on your team? Go for it! A desire to make a balanced team that can handle any situation? Be my guest! Want to be a youngster Joey and go for a Rattata-only run? Yes, you too can find out how hard that kind of challenge can truly be. It's the customization aspect of the core games that makes them so special and unique in the way they allow you to make the hero's journey in any way that you see fit. And indeed, they can do a lot to make the games fun and engaging by allowing you to craft your own story as you see fit. This critical aspect of the games has been the main selling point since day one, and will certainly be with the franchise forever in the mainline series, because it simply is the core heart of it all. These aren't just games you play through once and move on. You can have adventure after adventure with them, and there is no need for it to be the same each and every time. You are the master of your own path, and with the right push and incentive, you can be made to go through it over and over again, and no run will ever be quite the same each and every time, creating a degree of replayability that even today is unmatched among other franchises.
With the original generation that started everything now covered, let's move on to Generation 2 and the next part of the V.T.P. Thank you for watching this video. It brings me great joy to be able to speak to you all in the world each and every time we meet like this, to explore the many different facets of both the world of Pokemon as we know it, and the world as we live it, through every adventure we have with Pokemon by our side. If you'd like to, please subscribe, ring the bell and all that jazz, to keep yourself updated on content uploads and other materials of the like. You can also follow me on Twitter if you'd like to know right away when something new is uploaded, and my written works, from which most of this is based on, can be found on DeviantArt. Links to both can be found in the description down below. Remember that the world of Pokemon is a place full of wonder and mystery, and you never know what to expect. So, stay vigilant, keep watch, and always be prepared for the unexpected. Until next time, trainers and friends of all sorts, have a wonderful time.